is terribly, frighteningly alone. He sits on the rubbish heap. His wife has come and gone after this agreement. Yeah, she did. She rolled out. Uh, his only companion, if we can call it such, is a broken shard of pottery with which he scratches himself. Chapter 2, verse 8. At this stage, we can only guess what thoughts filled his mind. Did he think back to days of purpose when he got out of bed with drive and desire to work energetically to manage his farm and to govern his household? Did he remember the accolades given him for his justice, his care for his employees, and his business success? Were there memories of his sons and daughters in their childhood? Near where I live in central London, there used to be a bronze statue of a local man sitting on a bench overlooking the River Thames. A few meters in front of him is a bronze figure of a little girl, his daughter who had died in childhood. As he sits in his old age, his imagination plays tricks with him, and it is as if he sees his little daughter alive and playing there. That pair of statues always moves me to tears. Did Job's imagination play those kinds of tricks with him? We cannot know. It says you have until 10 a.m. to decide. They starting to close roads then. I feel you do. A visit of friends. But what happens next presses home to us Job's loneliness as never before. This is surprising because it seems to start so well. Quote, now when Job's three friends heard of all this evil, harm that had come upon him, they came. Verse 11. So Job has friends. The word quote unquote friend in the Old Testament, and especially in the wisdom literature, is stronger than our debased use, in which we may have many so called quote unquote friends, especially on social networking sites. Quote, a man of many companions, what we might call Facebook friends, may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Proverbs 18:24. A friend is bound to you with bonds of steadfast love. The strong Hebrew word is hesed or chesed, which means pledged, unbreakable, covenant love, and loyalty. Many years later, Hushai the Archite, David's friend, pretends to have gone over from David's side to support and counsel his rebel son Absalom. Although Absalom is pleased to have Hushai's counsel, he is surprised and chides Hushai. Is this your loyalty? Chesed, steadfast loyalty to your friend. Why did you not go with your friend? 2 Samuel 16:16 and 17. Chris Bell, hey Rick, stay safe. We here if you need anything. Thanks, brother Chris. I'll be here at the church, probably just holding it down at the church. Uh, Indeed, as Job himself says, quote, he who withholds kindness, hesed, steadfast covenant loyalty from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. Chapter 6, verse 14. It is therefore deeply encouraging to know that Job has three friends, men who are bound to him with ties of steadfast love and loyalty. Surely they will be able to help. It begins well. Quote, now when Job's three friends heard, they came, they made an appointment together to come. Verse 11. It must have taken weeks, if not months, for the news of Job's afflictions to reach them, for them to communicate with one another, to rendezvous, and then to travel to visit Job. And all this time, Job is alone on the rubbish heap with his shard of pottery for company. Job himself later refers to months of emptiness. and the lament of chapter 30 indicates a long suffering. Sympathy and comfort. But at last they come together rather than separately, perhaps because they sense that the task of comforting Job will be more than any individual can bear. They come, quote, to show him sympathy, end quote. That is, to enter into and share in his grief and comfort him. That is, to find a way to ease his pain. We must not read back into their coming the later disappointment and anger that their words bring. So far as we can tell, these are, quote, three good men and true, end quote. They were bound to Job as Jonathan was to David. They were not fair weather friends, Facebook friends who were glad to be able to, quote, name drop Job's acquaintance when he was rich and famous, or to take vacations in his luxury holiday villas. They were loyal friends who took the considerable trouble to travel and come to sympathize and comfort him when he was bankrupt and bereaved. Quote, there was a noble, gentle spirit. They were sincere. It is worth pausing to ask how, quote unquote, comfort works. The Hebrew word is nacham. Nacham. I don't know Hebrew, sorry. It is not the same as empathy. Empathy may be inarticulate because it focuses on entering into the feelings and experience of the sufferer as best we can. But comfort must be articulate and active. Empathy may be silent, but comfort must include speech. To comfort involves speaking to the mind and heart of the sufferer in such a way as to change his or her mind and heart. Comfort is an action, sometimes called, quote, speaking to the heart, end quote, that hopes and intends to bring about a change in how the sufferer thinks and feels about his or her suffering. When Joseph comforted his brothers, he did so in such a way as to reduce their fearfulness. Genesis 50, verse 21. His words lowered the level of their fear. The Levite in Judges 19 spoke, quote, kindly to, quote, in parentheses, spoke to the heart of, close parentheses. His wife, with a view to changing her mind and bringing her back home, Judges 19:3. Boaz cheers Ruth up when he comforts her with his words. Ruth chapter 2, verse 13. Joab tells David that unless he will speak kindly to, speak to the heart of his army by speaking words to them, they will abandon him. 2 Samuel 19:7. His comfort will change their minds. King Hezekiah spoke encouragingly to, spoke to the heart of his army to make them strong and courageous. 2 Chronicles 32, 6 and 7. Both the verb nacham and the expression speak to the heart refer to speaking words that bring comfort and change someone's mind or feelings. This is what we expect Job's friends to do. All right. The wisdom of the world is the next subtitle. Wisdom of the world. The wisdom of the world. And so they came each from his own place. End quote. And we might wonder what resources of comfort were available in the places from which they came. We are told their names and places. Eliphaz the Temanite Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Nemathite. Eliphaz is from Teman, Bildad from Shua, and Zophar from Naamah. Naamah appears in Genesis 4 as the daughter of one of Lamech's wives. Genesis 4:22. But this is a remote hint and tells us very little about Zophar. Shua is one of Abraham's sons by his wife Keturah, one of a group who, because they were not to inherit the promise through Isaac, were, quote, sent away from his son Isaac, eastward to the east country. Genesis 25:1-6. This all fits with Job being, quote, the greatest of all the people of the east. 1:3. Somewhere to the east of the promised land. The clearest clue is about Eliphaz. Teman was one of the most important towns of Edom. Jeremiah 49:20, Amos 1:12, and Obadiah 9. Eliphaz himself bears an Edomite name. One of the sons of Esau is called Eliphaz, Genesis 36:4. He is even described as, quote, the firstborn of Esau, Genesis 36:15. Whether the Eliphaz of Job is the same Eliphaz or not, we cannot know, but he does seem to be an Edomite. Edom was renowned for its wisdom. In Obadiah, the Lord says he will destroy the wise men of Edom, in Obadiah 8. And in Jeremiah, this wisdom is especially associated with Teman. Quote, concerning Edom, thus says the Lord of hosts, quote, is wisdom no more in Teman? Has counsel perished from the prudent? Has their wisdom vanished? Jeremiah 49:7. So it is no surprise that one of the friends who will, we hope, bring wise comfort to Job is an Edomite. It is a reasonable assumption that the other two also represent traditions of wise counsel. Certainly they speak of themselves as such, as becomes evident when they begin to speak. We have here not just three kind and loyal friends, but three wise friends who between them represent, as it were, the combined resources of the wisdom of the world. Can the world's wisdom with the world's kindness and loyalty help this lonely sufferer? The next section is called An Unbridgeable Gulf. An Unbridgeable Gulf. As they catch their first glimpse of their old friend, they are appalled. Quote, and when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. Verse 12. The smoking rubbish heap was often piled higher than the city itself. So we may imagine them approaching the city and spying this lonely figure crouched on the landfill pile in the distance. They knew it was Job. Probably they had been told in advance that that was where he was. We may suppose he was by now a well-known sight in the region. But they could hardly believe it was really him. Is that Job? We may imagine one saying to another, quote, so thin, so pale, so harrowed with pain and grief. And as they approach him, they shrink back in horror. Many have had this experience of visiting a familiar friend or family member and of being shocked at the altered appearance. It is not just the physical features that have altered, but something deeper. It is as though the calamity or the suffering has claimed the other in an experience alien to us. The other is no longer fully or even primarily in our familiar world, but inhabits a realm whose terrain is strange and foreign to us. We sense a chasm across which we cannot or will not venture, and from which we draw back in self-protective fear onto the safe ground of our familiar world. Or we attempt to cross the chasm somehow through sympathetic perhaps symbolic identification, hoping to draw the other back with us into the familiar world. Their not quote unquote recognizing him was a painful thing for them, but no doubt it was also a painful thing for him. No longer could there be the old natural friendly embrace, the hug or handshake, the smiles of friendship rekindled, the delighted warmth of welcome into his home. Instead, they did not, quote, recognize him. They found themselves behaving toward him as to a stranger. There was something painfully strange about his appearance, the emptiness in his eyes, the lines in his face, the brokenness of his demeanor. This is a sad assembly, very different from the happy family gatherings that punctuated the ordered life of the introduction, chapter 1, verse 4. This one is marked by alienation rather than fellowship, and loneliness rather than joy. Quote, and they raised their voices and wept, verse 12. Weeping here, baka, is not the shedding of silent tears. It is, quote, the sound of weeping. Psalm 6, verse 8. Something done with the mouth as well as the eyes. But they weep at him and not with him. This cannot be the quote unquote weeping with those who weep of Romans 12:15. They cannot sit, quote, with, end quote, him in any meaningful sense. He is unrecognizable. He has been taken away into a different realm, a realm of suffering so deep they cannot reach him. Silent with a corpse. Silent with a corpse. Job has torn his robe in mourning, chapter 1, verse 20, and they too tear theirs. And they, quote, sprinkle dust on their heads toward heaven, verse 12. Dust speaks of mortality and death. God says to cursed Adam, quote, you are dust, and to dust you shall return, Genesis 3:19. Joshua and the elders of Israel tear their clothes, fall to the ground, and put dust on their heads after the disaster at Ai, Joshua 7:6. The Israelite who reports the capture of the ark by the Philistines comes to Shiloh with his clothes torn and with dirt on his head, 1 Samuel 4:12. After Tamar has been raped by her half-brother Ammon, she tears her clothes and puts ashes on her head, mourning for her lost fortune. Mourning for her lost future. Sorry. All right, Jessica, appreciate it. I'll try my best to stay safe. Thank you. 2 Samuel 13:19. To throw dust in the air toward heaven so that it falls on their heads is vividly to identify themselves in their grief with Job's dead children and probably also with Job himself, who has been grasped by death and is already being dragged down into the realm of the dead. Job is to them like a friend being sucked down by quicksand in the desert. They long to draw him up, but he is beyond their reach. He is as good as dead. Quote, and they sat with him on the ground, end quote. Verse 13. They do not sit on a carpet or on cushions, but directly on the ground. The ground is the place of the dust of death. It is the closest men on earth can get to Sheol. After the sack of Jerusalem, quote, the elders of the daughters of Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. Lamentations 2:10. Then comes silence, 7 days and 7 nights of silence. Quote, they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Job's suffering was, as we shall see, deeper than merely physical. It was made sharper by mental and spiritual grief. It was an anguish and an agony. This man who had been a very great man, chapter 1, verse 3, now suffers a very great suffering. What are we to make of this silence? It is at best ambiguous. Preachers often say that this long silence was the best thing that they did. And certainly, as we shall see in chapter 4, when they begin to speak, they do no good at all. So one writer concludes, quote, if for the most part Job's friends got things wrong, here, at the beginning, they do it right, end quote. Quote, here is genuine friendship. Here is deep ministry, end quote. He calls this, quote, the compassion of a silent presence, end quote. Another says, quote, their silence is a further expression of their genuine empathy, end quote. Others say they do honor by profound silence to his vast grief. Quote. For, quote, when grief is so crushing, what form but silence can sympathy take? End quote. Quote, they were true friends, bringing to Job's lonely ash heap the compassion of a silent presence. Quote. But while their silence may initially have been appropriate, it seems unlikely that it continued so. To sit quietly with a sufferer, to hold his or her hand, to listen patiently as he or she pours out his or her grief is one thing. But this silence is, quote, hugely extended, end quote. To refuse to speak a word to a sufferer for 7 days and 7 nights is eerie and not comforting. It is interesting that we are told they did not speak a word to him, verse 13. For all we know, they may have spoken with one another, so it may not have been silence after all, but just a refusal to speak to Job, which is quite another thing. Interesting. Even if it was total silence, which seems more likely, a 7-day silence symbolized mourning for the dead. It is what Joseph did for his father Jacob. It is what the loyal city of Ramoth-Gilead did for King Saul, 1 Samuel 31:13. Quote, Job's friends mourned for him as one already dead, quote. Last paragraph of this section says, it is as if they call for the hearse and sit by Job with the coffin open and ready for him. There is no point talking to a corpse. One just weeps by it. To them, Job is no longer a living person. Their silence may not be so much a silence of sympathy, although it may have begun as such, but a silence of bankruptcy. They say nothing because they have nothing to say that will bring him comfort. It seems to them too late for that. Let me get my drink. Take a sip of my drink real quick. It's good. Needed that. It says the loneliness of suffering is the next little section. The loneliness of suffering. Whatever the meaning of their silence, the book of Job brings home to us the loneliness of suffering. The friends came with kind intentions. They came together. They brought with them the wisdom of the world, all the resources available within the world to comfort their suffering friend, but they were bankrupt, able to sympathize up to a point, but utterly unable to comfort. Before they came, Job was all alone on the rubbish heap. After they came, he was yet more deeply alone as he sat alongside them, but was utterly ignored by them, with not a word addressed to him as a person. Before there was no one physically or emotionally close to him. Now he has proximity. They sit by him, but is still without intimacy. The last paragraph of this section says, sometimes in Scripture there are corporate laments. Psalm 137 is one such. But this is so personal, and Job is so alone. Suffering does that. Even a non-serious illness cuts us off from others. We have to miss out on a family outing, a party, or a gathering. There is, in parentheses, in the title of an old play, close parentheses, quote, laughter in the room next door, end quote. And if even a trivial suffering begins to isolate the sufferer, heavy suffering isolates acutely. Even a shared loss is experienced uniquely by each bereaved person. When a child dies, the father alone knows what it is to be the father of this dead child. Only the mother enters the unique depths of loss as the mother of this son or daughter. However much they share, at the deepest level, they suffer alone. In his book, The Anatomy of Loneliness, Thomas Wolfe writes, quote, "The most tragic, sublime, and beautiful expression of loneliness which I have ever read is the book of Job." End quote. We need to recognize that those who suffer, suffer alone, and Job is terribly alone. The loneliness Job foreshadows. Job, in his awesome aloneness, foreshadows another believer, an even greater man who endures an even deeper suffering. This believer, too, was with his dearest friends in a garden outside Jerusalem. He told them to sit and wait while he prayed. He took with him his three closest friends, quote, "and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. He said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch,'" end quote. He went on a little farther, fell on the ground and prayed, quote, "with loud cries and tears," end quote. But when he came back, he found them sleeping. "Well, could you not watch 1 hour?" he asked sadly. Mark 14:32 through 42 and Hebrews 5:7. He prayed and wept alone. And the next day he suffered alone, stripped of his clothes, robbed of his friends, with even his mother having to keep her distance from the cross. He had said to his friends that although they would leave him alone, he was not alone, quote, "for the Father is with me." John 16:32. But in the deepest intensity of his suffering, he cried out in anguish, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Mark 15:34. As the old hymn puts it, quote, "He bore the burden to Calvary and suffered and died alone." There is a deep sense in which the lonely sufferings of Jesus Christ mean that no believer today is called to enter Job's loneliness in its full depth, as someone has put it. Here's the last portion of this chapter. It says, "Suffering encloses a man in solitude. Between Job and his friends, an abyss was cleft. They regarded him with astonishment as a strange being, ... but they could no longer get to him. Only Jesus could cross this abyss, descended into the abyss of misery, plunge into the deepest hell. However alone the believer in Christ may feel today, the reality is that he or she is not ultimately alone as Job was." Chapter 4, Weep with Those Who Weep. It's chapter 4 of this book about Job chapter 3. Let me take a sip. 11:27, kind of late. Gotta hydrate, dude. That's right. All right. We come now to, quote, "a poem of immense power and poignancy," unquote. Quote, "In the end, it was Job who broke the silence," in verse 1. This is like David in Psalm 39, struggling with the presence of the wicked. "I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail, and my distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me. As I mused, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue." Psalm 39, 2 and 3. In a similar way, Job's inner anguish has been boiling up with him, and in the end, he cannot hold it in. And out it pours in the darkest chapter of the book, and yet this outpouring of grief is not yet the beginning of a conversation. We have watched the loneliness of Job. Now we listen to his loneliness. Chapter 3 is a soliloquy. Job is not speaking here to anybody. He is not speaking to his friends. The cycles of speeches begin with Eliphaz in chapter 4. He is not speaking to God. He is just speaking with himself. And although no doubt the friends are within earshot, and surely God is listening, this soliloquy deepens the solitariness of Job. Although his friends hear his words, it will become apparent that they have not really heard his heart. And although God has undoubtedly listened with a father's heart of love, Job has absolutely no awareness of that patient listening ear at this stage of the tragedy. A true Christian believer may be taken by God through times of deep and dark despair. This may happen to a man or woman who is affirmed by God as a believer before the darkness, who remains a believer in the darkness, and who will finally be vindicated by God as a believer after the darkness. He or she may be taken through this darkness even though he or she has not fallen into sin or backslidden from the faith in Jesus Christ. This is a very important truth. In Job 3, we must, quote, weep with those who weep. Romans 12:15. When I first preached this chapter at the church where I was pastor, we did not sing at all in the service. Not a hymn nor a song. I'm sorry, not a hymn, not a song. Although some of us had come to the service feeling quite cheerful, our own circumstances full of hope, we needed to weep with one who wept. So we read together Psalm 137, where the people of God are asked to sing one of the songs of Zion but cannot sing. So deep is their distress. That is a terribly painful psalm, with its desperate cry for justice wrung from broken hearts. Quote, we have seen our young children murdered. We have heard their screams. Well, just maybe someone will do that to your children, you torturers. And when they do, good for them. Those are strong words, but that is how they felt. Quote, we cannot sing, and if you force us to be happy, it will add torment to our misery. Quote, cheer up, pull yourself together, end quote, said their tormentors, but they could not. In that church service, we listened to the puzzling story of William Cowper, the great Christian poet and hymn writer. His life was blighted, first by the death of his mother when he was 6, how 53 years later, when someone sent him a portrait of her, he wrote a moving poem that makes it clear his grief was ever fresh. That poem included the lines, I heard the bell tolled on thy burial day. I saw the hearse that bore thee slow away. And turning from my nursery window, drew a long, long sigh and wept a last adieu. We heard how Cowper's father sent him away to a boarding school where he was cruelly bullied and he probably never recovered in his mind. And how, after a 2-year engagement, his fiance's father forbade the marriage. How, before his conversion, he suffered repeated episodes of deep depression illness. Deep depressive illness. I was struck, he wrote, quote, with such a dejection of spirits as none but they who have felt the same can have the least conception of. Day and night I was upon the rack, lying down in horror and rising up in despair. We listened to how, age 31, Cowper suffered a catastrophic psychotic breakdown, tried 3 times to take his own life, and was committed to an asylum. Today, it would be called a psychiatric hospital. This asylum was run by an evangelical Christian, and it was there 6 months later that Cowper met the Lord Jesus Christ and became his disciple. Describing his conversion, he wrote, quote, unless the almighty arm had been under me, I think I should have died with gratitude and joy. My eyes filled with tears and my voice choked with transport. I could only look up to heaven in silent fear, overwhelmed with wonder and love. It was a wonderful change and a real conversion. And yet, on 4 more occasions in his life, he suffered deep depressive illness. And shortly before he died of dropsy in 1800, one of the last things he said was, quote, I feel unutterable despair. Now, this was a Christian, a real Christian who bequeathed to the church some of its deepest and greatest hymns. In that service, we looked together at his great him, quote, "Oh, for a closer walk with God," end quote, in which he laments the loss of the blessedness he had first known when he met the Lord Jesus, and how his diagnosis for his despair is that there must be an idol in his life. If only he can be helped to tear that idol from God's throne in his life, then again his walk will be close with God, and calmness and serenity will return. Where is the blessedness I knew when first I saw the Lord? Where is the soul refreshing view of Jesus and his word? The dearest idol I have known, whatever the idol be, help me to tear it from thy throne and worship only thee. So shall my walk be close with God, calm and serene my frame. So pure light shall mark the road that leads me to the Lamb. And we consider the possibility that, great though that hymn is, and as much as it applies to many believers, it may have been written out of a false diagnosis of Cowper's own condition. His despair might not have had anything to do with backsliding or turning away from the worship of the true God. As we shall see in the study, Job's despair was not the result of backsliding or unforgiven sin. Page 68. In that service, we also listened to the unrelieved laments of Psalm 88 and Jeremiah 20, verse 14 through 18, where we read, "Cursed be the day on which I was born. The day when my mother bore me, let it not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought the news to my father, a son is born to you." Excuse me. Making him very glad. Let that man be like the cities that the Lord overthrew without pity. Let him hear a cry in the morning and an alarm at noon, because he did not kill me in the womb, so my mother would have been my grave, and her womb forever great. Why did I come out from the womb to see toil and sorrow, and spend my days in shame? That's heavy. We listened to the lament of Job 3, and then after the sermon, we went home. It was a sobering evening with one aim, that we might grasp that a real believer may go through blank despair and utter desperation, that a blameless believer who has not fallen into sin may go through utter dereliction, and yet at the end be seen to be a real believer, that we might grasp that we ourselves, if we walk closely with Christ, may go through very deep darkness, deeper even perhaps than if we had not walked faithfully in his footsteps. And that as we grasp this sobering truth, we may learn to weep with those who weep. Job 3 is a very important chapter for contemporary Christianity. There is a version of Christianity around that is shallow, trite, superficial, quote, happy clappy, as some put it. It is a kind of Christianity that, as has been said, quote, would have had Jesus singing a chorus at the grave of Lazarus. We have all met it easy triumphalism. We sing of God in one song that, quote, in his presence our problems disappear, quote. In another that, quote, my love just keeps on growing, quote. Neither was true for Job in chapter 3, and yet he was a real and blameless believer. Someone has written a book about Christians who suffer depression and anxiety. It is called "I'm Not Supposed to Feel Like This." That is a provocative title. The authors state, quote, "It is bad enough that I feel low or anxious, but on top of that I feel guilty, for I ought not to feel low as a Christian. I feel that I ought to be able to cast my cares upon him, for he cares for me," 1 Peter 5:7, and yet somehow I can't. In Job 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 10, we watch this blameless believer suffer heartrending loss. His possessions ruined, his children killed, his health destroyed, and we listened, as Job could not listen to the conversations in heaven that lay behind his loss, between God and the Satan, the enemy, and how the Lord gives his terrible permissions to the Satan to torture Job. Job is not being punished for his sin, Exactly the reverse. Job suffers precisely because he is conspicuously godly, and he suffers deep deprivation, physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual loss. And yet still he shows faith. After the first two trials, we hear two very remarkable and often celebrated responses. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. 121. Chapter 2, verse 10. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? Both Jewish and Christian piety have wanted to major on Job's faith. This is not surprising, for Job's faith here is very wonderful. But the danger with our focusing on 121 and 210 is that we make Job's faith two dimensional. He suffered, he trusted. We say, quote, and so should we, end of story, end quote. But it is far from the end of the story, for in chapter 3, verse 1, he curses the day of his birth. And we are brought up short, for Job then goes on lamenting and protesting chapter after chapter. We must not soften this. We must remember that at the end of the book, God affirms that Job has spoken rightly of him, 42:7. That Job is God's servant, that Job is a righteous man who can therefore pray and expect his prayers to be heard. The despair of Job 3 is the authentic experience of a man affirmed by God at the start, chapter 1, verse 8, and chapter 2, verse 3, and affirmed again by God at the end, 42, verse 7. We need to remember that it is very surprising for Job 3 is a dark chapter. Feel that. The Satan has first attacked the outer skin of Job's possessions, wealth, and household. Then he has gone in closer to ravage the skin, so to speak, of his family, killing his 10 children. And then he has gone deeper still to strike the literal skin of Job's body. But the Satan's attack has penetrated deeper still, for he has struck at Job's heart. And now, for the first, but not the last time in the book, we hear the cry of Job's heart and soul. So far in the story, we have mostly been looking at Job, listening to the heavenly conversations, looking from above at the earthly disasters, and hearing from Job only the brief affirmations of pious trust in 121 and 210. We have watched his loneliness as his comforters sit with him in a terrible 7 day and 7 night silence. Excuse me. Chapter 2 ends with the words, his suffering was very great, end quote. We're about to learn just how great as we listen to his inner experience. This last paragraph of this section says, so let us go with Job into his dark lament. As we sing with Job verse by dark verse, I want us to notice three features of his lament. The first is that in his darkness, Job can only look back. His mind is full of regrets and is empty of hope for the future. The second is that he cannot rest, but is unbearably troubled. In each of these themes, we will find a paradoxical glimmer of light. It is not easy to find the gospel in Job 3, but as in all scripture, it is there. It will not do to immerse ourselves in the darkness and then say in a shallow and banal way, quote, well, it was pretty bad, but thank God Jesus has come and now it's all okay. It is not okay, and it is dishonest to pretend that it is. Instead, we must see how glimmers of the gospel may be seen in the ashes of Job's rubbish heap. The third feature is that Job's lament extends beyond his individual experience to the common experience of undeserved sufferings by the godly throughout the world. In this, too, there is the gospel. Good evening. Good evening. Good to have you on. Reading some commentary on Job. It says Job's words fall naturally into three parts: a curse, verse 3 through 10, a lament, verse 11 through 19, and an agonized question, verse 20 and 26. So this is on chapter 3 of Job. He's talking about explaining chapter 3. So in chapter 3, verse 3 through 10, a curse. It says, Job's outburst begins with a carefully crafted curse. Job cursed the day of his birth, verse 1. He does not curse God as the Satan has said he would, and as his wife exhorts him to do, but he comes right to the brink of doing this. He curses literally his day. The ESV is probably right to translate this as the day of his birth. In verse 3 through 10, he expands on this to give a comprehensive curse on his very existence. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Verse 3. The day on which Job was born, and the night 9 months earlier in which he had been conceived together, supply the two foundations of his existence as a human being, indeed as a man. The word usually indicates a grown male in his strength and dignity. I'll give you a little hello. There you go. A grown male in his strength and dignity, as opposed to a child. This lament is not at the troubles that have come upon some insignificant creature, a weakling or a nobody. These disasters have come upon a man of distinction, greatness, and dignity. It says, this is a comprehensive wish, not only that he had not been born, but that he had not even begun to exist as a fetus. Verse 4 and 5 expand on the day of his birth, and then verses 6 through 10 on the night of his conception. It says, let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. Verse 4 and 5. Every movie maker knows that darkness is associated with sadness, danger, and gloom. Often the sad parts of a movie are set on rainy days or with a blue filter to indicate nighttime. Now we must take that idea and press it far beyond the worst horror film, right to the gates of hell. When time began, darkness was everywhere, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day. Genesis 1, 2 through 5. What version is? It's just like a commentary by Christopher Ash. So Christopher Ash, I don't know if you can see that. It's like a commentary on Job. So it's just his breakdown of what of Job chapter 3. So it says, light is about God, goodness, creation, order, and life. For a day to become night is for a part of creation to be undone. It says, Job piles up words for darkness and pours them onto the day of his birth. Quote, let that day be darkness. I need to get this book a break. Yeah, it is cool. It is cool. His name's Christopher Ash. And Christopher Ash. And you can just type in Christopher Ash Job. And it's from the Preaching the Word series. Yeah, it's pretty cool. It is pretty cool. But yeah, you can find it, Christopher Ash on Job. It says, Job piles up words for darkness and pours them onto the day of his birth. Quote, let that day be darkness, he says. Let it never have come into existence as a day. Quote, may God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. For God to seek or pay attention to something is for it to be a place or time where God is present in his life-giving power. The New Jerusalem will be called sought out, a city not forsaken. Isaiah 62:12. To be sought by God is the opposite of being God forsaken. Here at the root of Job's existence is to be a God forsaken day. That is no day at all. A day that is night, a day with darkness at noon. Yes, I do. Yes. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I'm at First Baptist Roseland in Roseland, Louisiana's Tangible Hope Parish. So about 30 minutes north of Hammond, like 25 minutes north of Hammond. So what town or city are you in? Yeah, like north of Hammond, Louisiana. It says, let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Verse 5. This is not the darkness of a naturally cloudy day, but the deep darkness. That is the shadow of death itself. The word means a thick, deep darkness like that found in a mine shaft, or in the regions of the dead. Before I go to the land of darkness and deep shadow. You know Wanda McCoy. Yeah, of course. Yeah. That's my aunt. Yeah, in front of her house. That's right. Yeah. Yodi. Yeah, that's Miss Yodi. I saw her today. That's right. It is the place of the gates of death, where the gates of death stand parallel to the gates of deep darkness. When God brings salvation, he turns deep darkness into the morning. Amos 5:8. Job's desire is that these death powers of gloom and deep darkness would lay claim to Job's birthday, that they would win back their demonic rights over this created day, Job 3:5. The word claim, Gaal, is also used positively. Yes, we'll be there Sunday. Yeah, I feel you. Yeah, tomorrow, as of right now, we are doing like parking lot church, preaching in the parking lot tomorrow morning, but I guess the big storm's coming, and then we'll see what happens. Yeah, next Sunday we're planning on being in the building, but we'll see how it all shakes out. We're praying for everybody. Pray the storm calms down and we don't everybody lose power and all that. Hopefully everybody be safe and healthy. All right. But I think it's supposed to kick off, be strong around 2 p.m. tomorrow. The word claim, Gaal, is also used positively of the redemption accomplished by the kinsman redeemer. Here, in an ironic reversal, Job wishes that the powers of darkness would redeem his day from light into endless darkness. That's heavy. Quote, let clouds, that is, supernatural clouds that blot out every trace of light, dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it, end quote. Verse 5. The blackness of the day means an eclipse, a source of supernatural dread and terror to ancient peoples. The word terrify speaks of, quote, an uncanny feeling that causes every fiber of one's being to shudder, leaving one powerless. Life is so painful that Job wishes the roots of his existence had been recaptured by death and darkness, that he had never existed in the presence of God. He wishes God would rewind the tape of creation and undo the part that led to his existence. And then, to press this wish home to its most radical conclusion, he does the same for the night of his conception in verse 6 through 10. And Job's up against it, man. Job is up against it. That night let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those who cause it who curse the day. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Verse 6 through 8. The night of Job's conception had not been night in any spiritual sense. It had been a time of life and joy, a time of sexual joy for his parents, a time when a new human life sprang into being, a time in which that wonderful and astonishing moment had happened when two DNAs fused and a new human being was procreated. It had been a time that imaged the creative power of God triumphing over darkness and evil. But Job cannot rejoice in this. He wishes that night had been truly night in the darkest and deepest sense imaginable. He wishes it would be like the plague of darkness over Egypt at the time of the Exodus, or the night when Judas went out to betray Jesus. John comments, and it was night. John 13:30. He wishes it had been that kind of God-forsaken night. He wishes that, quote, thick darkness, darker than any natural darkness, which is often illuminated by moonlight, starlight, or even candles, would seize that day, abduct it, take it out of the calendar. He wants it removed from the days and months of the year, so that every calendar from then on will have that night missing. Verse 6. Far from being an empty time, that night had been fruitful. But Job wishes it had been barren, like rocky soil yielding no crops, like a barren woman giving no children. There had been in it a joyful cry, perhaps the literal joyful sound of his parents' lovemaking, but certainly the poetic, joyful cry of the night itself, personified, giving a shout of joy that a child was conceived. How many childless couples long for the night when that joyful sound will be heard? But Job wishes it had never been. Verse 7. Give me 1 second. Gotta write down a few things real quick. All right. Let's see. So yeah, we are going through Job, going through a commentary on Job by Christopher Ash. Christopher Ash on Job. So, but Instagram, you only allowed to record for 1 hour. So I have to shut this down and start it back up. So sorry about that. All right, gotta restart that. Boom. All right, there we go. So after 1 hour, Instagram cuts off, and you got to like reboot it. But we had a bunch of people on there, so that was good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, let me get my drink. We'll get back to try to finish that chapter. Finish that chapter for tonight. It's 11:57. (11:57 p.m. Central Time, 12:57 Eastern). All right. It says he wishes that someone somewhere had the power and authority to curse the day. He wishes for someone to, quote, rouse up Leviathan, verse 8. Leviathan, whom we shall meet again in Job 41, was the storybook sea monster of chaos, the great enemy of the Creator, whose mission it was to undo the order and beauty God had made. Job pictured Leviathan as having keepers, professional curse bringers, who can whistle for Leviathan and call him to come and destroy part of the created order. He wants them to stir up from the depths this chaotic, evil, supernatural sea monster whose design is always to bring disorder in place of order, death in place of life, darkness swallowing life. It is rather like in the Lord of the Rings when those making up the Fellowship of the Ring are passing through the mines of Moria, and one of the hobbits accidentally stirs up the monstrous Balrog with terrible consequences. But Job wants this to be done deliberately. He wishes for a supernatural demonic intervention to have prevented his conception and birth. He summons the most powerful sorcerers in the universe to do this for him. Quote, I wish they would call him to curse the night of my conception so that I might never have been born, he says in essence. Man, that's heavy. Job is up against it. Of course, it is all fanciful. He cannot effectively curse the past. The past is past, and he cannot change it. Quote, the language is fierce, but the curse has no teeth, and the wish is hopeless. Its power is wholly literal, is Its power is wholly literary. Its extravagance, the violence of Job's feeling. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. Job wishes this night, as well as being supernaturally dark, would have been a night that never ended in day, a night that never saw the morning stars, traditionally Venus and Mercury, assuring another victory of light over darkness. Verse 9. Here is a night in which watchmen can watch and wait for the morning, as in Psalm 130, verse 5 and 6. But they will watch and wait in vain, for morning will never come. They will never see the eyelids of the morning. The first light in the eastern sky that announces sunrise is at hand. The dawn personified it as a beautiful woman whose eyelids are suggested of the full splendor to be revealed when the dawn comes. Job 3, verse 9. But for Job, there is no beauty of dawn, no hope, no confident waiting for a light at the end of his dark tunnel. Why does Job make these terrible wishes? Because that night, quote, did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, end quote, to prevent new life from entering at the time of conception, to keep the sperm from fusing with the ovum, to prevent his first beginning to exist, verse 10. This is a retrospective contraceptive wish applied to his own existence. This is terrible. In normal life, almost nothing can rival conception and birth as signs of hope. A wife tells us she is expecting a baby, and we rejoice, or we ought to. Her position is quite literally pregnant with hope, even if sometimes mixed with feelings of inconvenience, alarm, or anxiety. Fundamentally, there is excitement and there are eager preparations. And when we hear of a safe birth, this is even more so. The whole affair is full of looking forward. We ask expectant parents, quote, is there anything you are looking forward to, end quote. And they look at us as if we are mad. Quote, what a silly question. Of course we're looking forward. Our lives and the mother's body are literally filled with the hope and expectation, end quote. But for Job, it has all gone into the negative. All he sees is a no entry sign to the future. Quote, if only I had never been, end quote. Quote, what are you looking forward to, Job? Quote unquote, nothing. If he tries to look forward, all he can see is a blank wall of hopelessness as his affections and longings are turned back upon themselves in despair. There is no future for me. Would that there had been no past. Here is bitter memory unsweetened by hope. In St. Nicholas Church in the village of Moreton in Dorset, England, there's a beautiful window engraved by Lawrence Whistler. It is a memorial to a local fighter pilot shot down and killed in the Battle of Britain. It shows the broken propeller of his plane, and on it are two pairs of initials, his and his young wife's, with the years of their marriage, 1939 to 1940. What did that premature death do to that young widow? What happened in her mind to all the potential and hope with which their marriage began? The children they might have had, their future together. There is no comment in the window, but in those initials and those dates is such a compression of grief. The last line of verse 10 is the climax of this section. Dot, 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 nor hide trouble from my eyes. Job's conception and then Job's birth have opened the way for Job's troubles. For had those doors been closed, trouble would have been hidden from Job's eyes. The word trouble, amal, speaks often in the book of Job's plight. Eliphaz says accusingly that those who quote unquote sow trouble will reap the same, as Job evidently has, chapter 4, verse 8. He says that, quote, man is born to trouble, end quote, 5, verse 7. Job himself speaks of, quote, nights of misery, Amal. Zophar promises that if Job repents, You will forget your misery. Mal. Eliphaz says the godless conceive trouble, and Job accuses his friends of being miserable, troublesome comforters. Job would never have known the unrest, the distress that he now endures. He would never have known the pain of bankruptcy, the grief of bereavement, the misery of sickness, the evils that seem to him so dark that they render life meaningless and worthless. This theme of trouble and unrest dominates the remainder of the chapter. In chapter 3, verse 13, he longs to lie down and be quiet, to sleep, to be at rest. In verse 17, he yearns for a life unsullied by troubling, a life of rest. And in verse 26, at the very end, he laments that he has no ease, no quiet, no rest, but only trouble. It is not simple pain that hurts Job, it is trouble and unrest. Job is restless, but he is not resigned to his fate. He knows there is something terribly wrong. He will see that this unrest is itself a paradoxical sign of hope. Job has not given up. He will not give up. He is on a journey, we might almost say, through crucifixion to resurrection. But before the resurrection, there must be this terrible loneliness as he is increasingly isolated, not only from other human beings, but from his own past and future. He hangs suspended between past and future, utterly alone and utterly without the experience of hope in his heart, and yet he will not give up. A lament, a lament. Verse 11 through 19. And so Job's pointless, ineffective curse merges into a desperate lament. This lament is carefully structured into parts. Each part begins with the question, why, and ends with a description of the place of the dead. Verse 11. Each of these parts help us to understand the other. Part 1 is found in verses 11 through 15. Why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me? Or why the breast that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept. Then I would have been at rest. With kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Part 2 is seen in verses 16 through 19. Or why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. Part 1 begins with the question, if I had to be conceived and born, why did I have to be born and stay alive? Why could I not have been just another statistic of per, perin, perinatal mortality, dying at or immediately after birth? There is a movement in verse 11 and 12 from womb to knees to breast. This is a movement toward sustainable life on earth. The knees may be the knees of Job's father or of his mother. For a father to take a baby on his knee seems to have indicated acceptance of paternity and responsibility for the child's support and future. In a variation of this custom, the children of Joseph's grandson, Machir, are described as being literally, quote, born on Joseph's knees, end quote. Genesis 50, verse 23. Genesis 50, verse 23. The ESV renders this as, quote, counted as Joseph's own, end quote. More naturally here, however, it would seem to refer to a mother taking a baby on her knees prior to putting the baby to her breast. In Isaiah 66:12, those who love Jerusalem are described as being lovingly bounced upon her knees in the context of being nursed and fed. This would seem to be the picture here. Job had traveled from his mother's womb to being dandled fondly on his mother's knees and then lovingly put to his mother's breast. It is a beautiful picture of a young life loved and nurtured. But for Job, it was a disaster. All it did was to launch him into a life that would end with unbearable misery. Job longs for the place of the dead. Verse 13 piles up four consecutive images of rest. First, quote, I would have lain down, end quote. That is, I am tired, I want to lie down. Then he would have, quote, been quiet, away from the noise and tumult. Third, he would have enjoyed the peace of sleep. Lastly, he, quote, would have been at rest, end quote. This is normal human experience. At night, we lie down, we are quiet, we sleep, we find rest. It is rest for which Job most deeply longs. But who would have been his resting companions? Here we come up against a surprise. In verse 14 and 15, Job speaks of a familiar threesome of powerful men, kings, counselors, and princes. The word counselors means senior ministers of state, such as Hushai and Ahithophel under King David, 2 Samuel 15 through 17. The word princes simply means powerful people. This threesome appears in Ezra chapter 7, verse 28. Quote, the king and his counselors and all the king's mighty officers. And Ezra 8:25, the king and his counselors and his lords. These three are a comprehensive way of saying powerful and influential people in the world. In our terms, they include presidents, prime ministers, senators, media barons, CEOs, billionaires, and anyone else who exercises power. Job describes these men as having, quote, rebuilt ruins for themselves, end quote, and having had gold, and having filled their houses with silver, verse 14-15. The word ruins may refer to ruined cities that these powerful people sought to rebuild as a mark of their greatness. God himself speaks of his intention to rebuild the ruins of Jerusalem. This is possible. In the 20th century, we saw Saddam Hussein proclaiming his greatness by his plans to rebuild ancient Babylon. Interesting. Alternatively, the text may mean not that they rebuilt ruins, but that the buildings they built in their lifetime are now fallen into ruin. The NIV reads, quote, who built for themselves places now lying in ruins. Verse 15. This accords better with Job's argument here. The reference to wealth and filling their houses with silver in verse 15 would seem to be parallel to the description of the ruins in verse 14, and this may help us understand the imagery. One persuasive suggestion is that the quote-unquote houses of verse 15 are the burial places they built for themselves, which they filled with wealth to take with them to the afterlife. The now ruined state of these monuments and mausoleums show that, in fact, these powerful men are in the place of the dead. They are now on the same level as everybody else. They take with them neither their wealth nor their power. However, we understand the detail of verse 14 and 15. The main picture is clear. The place of the dead is where powerful people end up, no matter how rich and strong they were in this life. But why does Job specifically speak of his longing to be with these people? He is surely not expecting a privileged status in Sheol. The key would seem to be found in the second part of the lament in verses 17 through 19. Verse 16 echoes verses 11 and 12 with essentially the same question. Why, if I had to be born, could I not have been stillborn and never see the light of life? I wish I had gone straight from the womb to Sheol. But in verses 17 through 19, we see a different portrait of his prospective Sheol companions. Instead of just kings, counselors, and princes, we now have two groups. On the one hand, the wicked, who cause turmoil and trouble, the taskmaster, the great, the master, and on other hand, the weary, the prisoners, the small, and the slave. The kings, counselors, and princes are now seen as the oppressors. Here, humanity is viewed through the lens of power and divided into the powerful and the powerless. Job clearly identifies himself with the latter group. The former are wicked and cause trouble for the latter. The former run slave labor camps. The former exploit the weak and use their power for their own advantage. The former are the slave owners and the slave drivers. Surely these are the same as the kings, counselors, and princes. They may have been rich and powerful, but they are wicked, and it is their selfish wickedness that causes so much of the suffering on earth. Job's distress here broadens beyond his own awful suffering. He knows that he is not the only human being on earth to experience unfair misery. In Isaiah 14, the king of Babylon comes to Sheol, and when he arrives, they say, quote, "Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms?" Isaiah 14:16. When alive, he had made people tremble and shake. He had caused trouble and turmoil. He causes it no more. The image of, quote, the voice of the taskmaster, end quote, is a haunting one, verse 18. It contains echoes of the Pharaoh's cruel taskmasters before the Exodus, Exodus chapter 3, verse 7, of, quote, the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, end quote, in Isaiah 9:4, and of the oppressor who marches roughshod over people in Zechariah 9:8. It is a penetrating image, heavy with the long shadow of human cruelty over the lives of sufferers. At the very end of his classic and deeply moving two-volume account of Auschwitz and his return home, the Italian Jew Primo Levi recounts, quote, a dream full of horror which has not ceased to visit me. Quote. Quote, it is a dream within a dream, end quote, in which he begins in peace, perhaps sitting at a table with his family or friends or in the green countryside, and yet he feels a deep and subtle anguish, the definite sensation of an impending threat. And then, quote, everything collapses and disintegrates around me, the scenery, the walls, the people, while the anguish becomes more intense and more precise. Now everything has changed to chaos. I am alone in the center of a gray and turbid nothing. And now I know what this thing means. And I also know that I have always known it. I am in the lager concentration camp once more, and nothing is true outside the lager. All the rest was a brief pause, a deception of the senses, a dream, my family, nature in flower, my home. Now this inner dream, this dream of peace is over, and an outer dream which continues. A well known voice resounds, a single word, not imperious, but brief and subdued. It is the dawn command of Auschwitz, a foreign word, feared and expected. Get up, watch, 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 watch. The voice of the slave driver cast a long shadow. The nightmare shadow of that voice never left him. Perhaps it echoed in his mind at the time of his death in the 1960s, very possibly by suicide. Job can find no rest on earth because he is now identified with the small, the weak, the downtrodden. He experiences with them the turmoil and restless misery of being oppressed by forces stronger than himself. It is probably not fanciful to extend this from the oppression of the Sabaeans and Chaldeans, who caused him such trouble in chapters 1 and 2, to the evil oppressor of his spiritual enemy, the Satan. So in verse 14 and 15, it is not that Job particularly wants to be with the kings, counselors, and princes. After all, among them will no doubt be the Sabaean and Chaldean chieftains who ravaged his property. Rather, he believes that in Sheol, at last, they will no longer be able to cause him trouble. Quote, if I had been stillborn, end quote, says Job in effect, quote, I would have been in Sheol, the place of the dead, and that would be peace. End quote. In his clearer moments, Job knows that is not true, that Sheol is a terrible place. In 17:14, he knows it is where decay and the worm are our father and mother, but in his desperation, he thinks it's the place of rest. The deep reason for Job's unrest is that he cannot understand his sufferings. He cannot understand why a believer, a man of godliness and piety, suffers with such mind numbing intensity. The inexplicable trouble shakes the foundations of his moral and ordered universe. It is for this reason he cannot and will not rest until he has found some resolution to this cosmic question. At heart, human rest is rooted in the rest of God when he looks on a completed and good creation. Genesis 2 1 through 3. Rest is predicted on cosmic order, a creation in which there are proper boundaries in which virtue is rewarded and vice punished, in which there is justice and in which goodness triumphs. Job longs to share that rest with God. At the moment, his experience is the polar opposite, so he ends his speech with a desperate question. An agonized question. Chapter 3, 20 through 26. Oh, let's get another sip of the drink. Gotta hydrate. Gotta stay hydrated. Thank God for that. Whew, let's finish this chapter. Call it a night. It says, an agonized question, chapter 3, 20 through 26. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than he hit? Mm, Messed that up bad. Let me try again. All right. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose day is hidden, whom God has hedged in? In verse 20, quote, him who is in misery, end quote, is singular, we think of Job, but quote, the bitter in soul is plural. Job's question does not relate to Job alone. Although God is not mentioned by name, the verb given implies that God has, quote, given it, as in chapter 1, verse 21, the Lord gave, dot, dot, dot. It is from the Lord that we receive good things and bad things. 2:10. The expression bitter in soul speaks of a deep distress. The childless and desperate Hannah experiences this deep distress, 1 Samuel 1:10. It is the bitter misery of the defeated and crushed. Hushai says to Absalom that David and his men are enraged, literally bitter of soul, ESV footnote, bitter of soul, after their expulsion from Jerusalem, 2 Samuel 17:8, and Ezekiel's lament for the trading city of Tyre, he speaks of the mariners weeping over her in bitterness of soul, Ezekiel 27:31. The expression is used of parents who have lost a child in 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, and of the sick and despairing King Hezekiah in Isaiah 38:15. These are men and women who have lost all hope and who cannot see the point of continuing to live. Why does God give them life in the first place? Asked Job. It's pretty cool. Yeah, this is some heavy stuff for real. I'm gonna plug this one phone in right here. See if I can do this. This is the FBC page. I don't know if I can. You turn it sideways. You you can't turn your phone while recording. Well, I can't get my phone to stay up while plugged in. A little crooked, but it's the church page. See how that goes. I have to build some type of phone holder while it can charge. We have to figure that out. Verses 21 and 22 speak with biting irony. These miserable people, of whom Job is one, long for death with the passionate desire of the treasure hunter, rushing out to the Wild West in the gold rush, dreaming of death as the hunter dreams of the yellow stuff. And when they die, their exuberance can only be understood when you think of the treasure hunter striking a rich vein of gold. The Roman writer Ovid speaks of a terrible curse, so that Someone has a reason for dying, but not the means. Job feels like a man on a life support machine who longs for it to be switched off. Job is obsessed with death as the only way out of trouble because life is so futile. Wilfred Owen gets this so poignantly in his poem Futility. Move him into the sun, gently its touch awake him once. At home, whispering of fields unsown, always it woke him, even in France. Until this morning and this snow, if anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs, so dear achieved, our sides, full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? Interesting. Owens writes of the untimely death of a young British farmer on the fields of the Western Front in World War I. In this poignant poem, Owen moves from one particular futile tragedy to a world that seems to have no point. The sun used to wake this young man, it won't wake him now. That same sun gave life to the cold earth at creation. Why? And in his anger he shouts, quote, "Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? Why did God bother to make the world at all?" This is what Job feels. In verse 23, he describes himself and others like him as walking on a way or path that is hidden from God's blessing and grace, a God-forsaken walk, and a path that is, quote, hedged in by God. To be hidden suggests it has no purpose or meaning. To be hedged in is an ironic twist to what the Satan had said. In 1 verse 10, the Satan said that Job's happy, prosperous life was hedged in by God's gracious protection. Now, he experiences a different kind of hedge, a hedge of razor wire. Not to keep the marauder out, but to keep Job imprisoned in a miserable life he longs to leave but cannot, a life that is locked into trouble with the key thrown away. He speaks of it again in a later chapter, quote, "God has walled up my way so that I cannot pass, and he has set darkness upon my paths." 19 verse 8. It is a life of cramped narrowness. Just as the world of an elderly person today gradually contracts from the world to the nation, no longer going abroad, from the nation to the neighborhood, from the neighborhood to the occasional walk in the garden, from the garden to being housebound, from the house to the bedroom, and from the bedroom to the coffin or casket. Job feels this is happening to him. He is hedged in, trapped, and he cannot escape, and he wonders why God is doing it. What is the point? Is there a point? In verses 24 through 26, there is a great emphasis on what, quote, comes upon Job. His sighing comes to him, verse 24a. His groanings are poured out over him like water, verse 24b. What he fears comes upon him, and what he dreads befalls him, verse 25. He has no rest, but trouble comes, verse 26. He is the target. Things happen to him. What is, quote, given, end quote, by God, quote, comes to Job. These things are the reality of his experience, but he does not and cannot know why. This is the source of his deep unease. He knows that God is the author, and he knows that these things have come to him, but why? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. Verse 24 and through 26. The word sighing or growing is a strong word, verse 24. It means something like, quote, my shrieks, end quote. The loud moans and wails that come from people devastated by tragedy. It is the kind of thing we see after an earthquake or terrorist bombing, when the injured and bereaved cry out aloud in their misery. Under the Pharaoh, the Hebrew slaves groan, the same word, because of their slavery, Exodus 2:23. At the exile, Jerusalem's people wail aloud, Lamentations 1, verse 4 and verse 8. It is an exhausting grief. Jeremiah's companion Baruch says, quote, I am weary with my groaning and I find no rest. Jeremiah 45:3. This is Job's daily diet. It comes to him in place of bread. He can only feed on his own misery. This is the lament of David in Psalm 22:1, quote, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? This grief is fulfilled many years later when a man cries out from a cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Matthew 27, verse 46. Verse 25 speaks of the things Job had most dreaded, which are now coming upon him. Right at the start in chapter 1, verse 4 and 5, we see Job anxious about possible troubles. But whatever troubles he may have dreaded in his worst nightmares are now fulfilled. Verse 26 is the climax of the speech with its four images of rest/unrest. Job is not at ease. He has no quiet. He has no rest, but instead just trouble. Three negatives: no ease, no quiet, no rest, and one terrible positive: trouble. This is torment, not just of body, terrible though that is, but of the soul. The word trouble is the keynote and the closing word of the speech. What a contrast to the idyllic picture of chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. A portrayal of a restful prosperity, untroubled by pain, a reassuring regularity, unbroken by disorder. The question why will echo throughout the book. Verse 20, we are drawn by the tragedy of Job into bigger and more alarming questions than the individual tragedy of Job himself. Job wants not only to undo his own life, but to question the creation of the world. Genesis 1 moves from darkness to light, from night to day, from intimacy to life. Job wants to put it all into reverse. Where is the gospel in Job 3? We know, if we are Christians, that for every believer, the best is yet to be. Always there are better things ahead. Always there is hope, because the future is God's future and our destiny is glory. But we need to recognize that there may be times in the life of a believer, when that future appears utterly blank and all we can do is look back with regret, consumed with, quote, if only, end quote. That is where Job is in Job 3. It is a bleak time. So where is the gospel in Job 3? It is not very obvious, but it is there in three ways. Even in the darkness, Job cannot avoid God. It seems unlikely that Job is conscious of the presence of God. Perhaps he would have echoed the words of C.S. Lewis in his moving personal reflection after the death of his wife, A Grief Observed. Lewis asked the question in bereavement, where is God? And he answers. This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once. That's interesting that C.S. Lewis wrote that book after his wife died. I didn't know that. A Grief Observed. Interesting. Very tough. And yet, Job knows that he cannot turn away from that door. Right here in the depth of his misery, he knows he has to deal with God. We shall see as the book unfolds that this is a great theme in his journey, even in God's felt absence, he is somehow there. We see this in the word given in verse 20. Light and life have been given by God, and therefore it is with God we must deal. Even in his absence, God is present as the focus of Job's loss. There is a glimmer of hope here, but it will take some time for that glimmer to become a ray. Job's restlessness is a paradoxical sign of hope. We have seen that the dominant tone of chapter 3 is relentlessness. Job cannot rest with things as they are, and therefore he will not rest. In his weakness, misery, and distress, there is yet an energy within Job that surges and drives him to discover the God who has treated him like this. Although he says he has no hope, his restlessness betrays him. A restless man is not a defeated man. A troubled man is not a hopeless man resigned to his fate. If there really is no hope, there is no point asking why, verse 20. And yet Job does ask why. And he asks it repeatedly and energetically. He says he wants to die, but his restless words betray him, for they point inexorably to life and resurrection. Job's darkness anticipates a deeper darkness. At the end of Job 3, we leave Job terribly alone, sitting with friends who want to comfort him but have nothing to say. We leave him able only to look back with bitter regrets that he ever lived, mired in deep darkness. Is there anything that can be said to him? And the last paragraph of this chapter says, I believe there is. Even at this stage, there is something to be said. Beyond the silence of bankruptcy, beyond even the silence of sympathy, we saw when considering chapter 2, 11 through 13, that Job's loneliness foreshadowed a greater loneliness. His darkness likewise anticipates a deeper darkness. 2,000 years ago, another blameless believer was in deep darkness, hanging on a cross at midday. Deeper than the darkness of night, deeper even than Job's darkness, and from his lips came the cry of dereliction, quote, my God, why have you forsaken me, end quote. Mark 15:33 and 34, in some strange way, because Job's darkness of soul foreshadows the darkness of the cross, there is within it hope of rescue. Amen. All right, so we'll say finished. We'll say August 28th. 2021. I'm going to say 11:59. $11:59 p.m. Even though it's really 12:37. Night before Hurricane Ida in the church sanctuary. All right. So there you go. We've finished that. It's page 84. All right. So we started page 57. Finished at 84. And it is August 28th. Well, now 29th, but 28th. We'll say 11:59 p.m. Night before I did. All right, cool. All right, I'm going to shut it down. Appreciate y'all tuning in. And we'll be on part 2 Job and his friends. Chapter 5, introducing Job's comforters, what not to say to the suffering believer. All right, should be interesting. Appreciate y'all tuning in. Something fun to do before a hurricane, I guess, to read some good books. Hurricane Ida is supposed to hit here in 14 hours. So we'll see what happens. See how it goes. Thanks for tuning in. God bless you guys. See here. Yo, just finishing up some reading of Job, commentary, Christopher Ash. This joint's a banger right here. Job. That thing is fire. Christopher Ash. Just finished page 84, the first part of the book. Got a big old hurricane coming. Big old hurricane coming tomorrow. About 14 hours about to hit where I'm at. Pray for my little town of Rose and pray for South Louisiana. South Louisiana is about to get bang, bang tomorrow. So keep us in the prayers, yo. Keep us in the prayers. I'm just shutting down. Been reading for like the last 2 hours or something. Hour and 43 minutes. But it's been good. That commentary book is a beast. So yeah, just writing down some notes from the reading time. Everything went real good. But yeah, that storm about to hit 2 p.m. Should be hitting us like 2 p.m. I think tomorrow. So I was just doing some reading before I call it a night. But you know, God is good. We're gonna trust the Lord. Trust the Lord and see what happens. we'll see how it goes. So, all right, cool. Well, I'm about to shut it down, charge all my stuff up before we lose power tomorrow. So, God bless. You too.